Zarreen used to be here in the anthropology department and honors. I'm very proud to have worked with Zarreen in her work and many of our other colleagues. And she's here to speak to us today about her work, which is in Rwanda, particularly in Kigali, and it's entitled The Emotional Worlds of Becoming a Startup, which is a project that is embedded in anthropology, in economics, and technology, in public and private. And we are looking forward, to listening to that work and its journey, and also to engage, in a very rich conversation. So thank you, Zarreen, and we look forward to listening to you. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Divine, and thank you to everyone for coming. So this presentation is based on the fieldwork in Kigali, like Divine mentioned, and it's part of my PhD project, which looks at the efforts from the startup ecosystem in Rwanda and its different actors and how it makes startups ready for investment through practices of legibility and replicability. So this presentation sits between these chapters that I've outlined. I looked at events and practices of social networking, the process of documenting startups through contracts and certificates, for which the observations and interviews that I will present today will sort of provide a kind of behind the scenes look. And I worked between these three field sites, this co-working Swedish hub, Law and Tech Center, and the focus of today's presentation, an incubator. Yeah. I originally thought of this project as one that would look at investment and philanthropy as a move away from development aid. And this still remains an important aspect of my project, but for the interest of time, I won't be able to get into that, but please feel free to ask about it. So I've titled this presentation, The Emotional Worlds of Becoming a Startup, and that's because startups and entrepreneurial citizens have given way to a particular framing of challenges and opportunities in Africa and around the world. While small to medium enterprises or SMEs remain the more widely recognized source of employment for the general population, startups have become a kind of political imaginary for what could be tested, innovated, and scaled quickly. In turn, aspiration, hope, frustration, excitement, and disappointment filter into and between startup founders and the network of support they receive in spaces such as the incubator. And so I ask, what role do these emotional and affective responses play in the incubator space? How can we situate the practice of partnering in the imaginary of business for development? Incubators are a blend of education and industry orientation. They're a staple of tech entrepreneurship ecosystems, particularly in nascent or emerging ecosystems that are considered to be in need of more support for early stage startups and entrepreneurs. Existing literature on entrepreneurship or startup ecosystems tend to focus on the outputs of an incubator, whereby impact evaluations in terms of job creation, venture success, and access to capital are some of the most vital metrics, often making their way into policymaking and development agendas. However, even if this incubator, sorry. So incubators that can be designed for people to meet someone they could go on to create a business with, or they could come in ready-made. They become spaces of manufactured serendipity. And in the space of manufactured serendipity, I want to bring forward psychometric tests and the team formation process for venture creation in this particular incubator. So this incubator, which I've pseudonymized as Uvumbuzi, is funded by a South African philanthropy foundation, which ran a very similar program in South Africa, where it's been active since 1979, mainly in the education and entrepreneurship sector. So this is a 13-month program with a 3-month residency program at the beginning. And this model of close contact, mentorship, and regular financial support was unlike some of the other incubator programs in Rwanda that took on a more one-size-fits-all approach. However, even if this incubator strength is the way that they curate specialized insight into one's own human capital through psychometric tests, the desire is still to produce an optimized entrepreneur, someone who can be invested in. Sylvia Lintner describes the incubator as a kind of educational boot camp. She explains that incubators train people to see self-economization as providing them with hopeful agency. And here, self-economization refers to the conversion of the self into human capital. And this is present in her book, Prototype Nation, which looks at makerspaces and incubators in Shenzhen, China. So the program invited participants from Kenya, Ethiopia, and Rwanda. It brought together close to 50 individuals, about 50-50 men and women, from the ages 21 and up. And other interlocutors that I spoke to in my fieldwork, particularly those who worked with other incubator programs, often heralded this model for its unique approach. The incubator participants came with varying backgrounds, including medicine, education, tech, and others. Some had experience with running startups or working in them, while others came straight out of degree programs, internships, and stable careers. And over the next few weeks, the participants would eat together, debate, converse, share experiences and desires over lunch and tea breaks. When Ethiopian New Year came around, the participants from Ethiopia wore their white linen traditional wear and shared injera with their cohort mates. Rwandans listened keenly to their cohort mates swap stories of ill governance, corruption, and the double-edged sword of the urban dynamism of Addis Ababa and Nairobi when starting a business. And in turn, the Rwandans shared stories of the strides that their government had made when it came to creating a desirable business environment. As part of the recruitment process in early weeks, psychometrically determined profiles were written and shared that were meant to help the participant identify complementary partners for their teams of 2 to 3 people for their business venture. In the report, participants were advised accordingly to assess their own areas of lacking, while also understanding strengths to attract highly capable individuals and convince them by showcasing themselves as valuable team members by effectively communicating what they would bring to the team. Participants were poring over their profiles, finding similarities between one another, the similarities with others, and reasoning that this contrast could make for a better, more well-rounded team, while finding unusual shared traits with others who may not make a good teammate, but could possibly go on to be a good friend. And as the program went on, deadlines for finished ideas and clear business plans put further pressure on the participants that anything that wasn't deemed relevant went unnoticed. Team formation was at the forefront of everyone's mind. Here I use the examples of 2 participants who here are referred to as Boaz and Kimani. Boaz being a Rwandan man and Kimani a Kenyan man, to show how they made sense of the reports in relation to the team formation stage. Boaz, I would learn, had no prior experience of running a company like some of the other participants. Instead, he referred to himself as a jack of all trades with experience in a range of areas. And this was one of the unique recruitment tactics of Uvumbuzi. Not necessarily seeking out one particular profile, and instead trying to bring together individuals with a diverse background in terms of experience and skill who would go on to find their business partner. However, as the program progressed and participants were encouraged to identify market opportunities and relevant solutions, a more specialized career path held more appeal, especially when it came to coming up with a business idea. Based on their experiences and expertise, participants would seek out potential teammates to build their business concept. I asked him how it was going with finding a team, and he looked a bit downtrodden when he shared his concerns about lacking a specific skill or specialization. I'm more of a jack of all trades. I've worked as many different things, he explained. What would a jack of all trades bring to a venture that needed a software engineer? Which of all trades might be of use if someone had mastered it already? He continued, but I looked at my profile and it said I was a shaper driver, so that might work in my favor as it was in the results category. He told me about his studies and prior work experience as a teacher and an editor. And together we went over which skills he might be able to pitch to potential teammates. Sylvia Lindner described the way that incubators produce a particular kind of subjectivity. They train people to become investors in their own human capital, citing Wendy Brown that the next step of Homo economicus as a neoliberal agent that seeks to strengthen his or her competitive positioning. This competitive positioning would become apparent when participants needed to leverage their characteristics and experiences. The reports from the incubator in some ways did the labor of self-conversion into human capital by giving the participants an initial selling point in themselves. But psychometric tests are not necessarily unique to Uvumbuzi. Lindner mentions personality tests in her field sites, referring to them as market devices of neoliberal finance capitalism. They are a common tool to bring participants in relation to their own human capital through a self-awareness and self-consciousness to render oneself attractive to the logics of investment. And we can see that this is a broader approach to managing interpersonal professional relations. At some point, I met a participant from a previous cohort, Kamalie, who had a business venture currently up and running in Rwanda in the coffee sector. And he had done psychometric tests before. And when I asked him if he found the profiles and the tools for the team formation useful to find a co-founder, he responded, for how I work, they were useful. For who to partner with, no. He went on to say that while they were useful, he reflected on a running joke whereby he was categorized as a team builder, but found himself without a partner at some point. He also recounted being courted by another team, but declining because they seemed too friendly with each other, saying, it's also very dangerous when you don't realize when the team isn't working and you don't want to break it for the sake of friendship. And that happened with, I think, the 2 teams that were asked to leave the program. Team formation appeared incredibly stressful for the participants, as a noticeable few shuffled uncomfortably and exchanged glances whenever Theo, the program manager, reminded them before a session of their imminent significance, while simultaneously assuring them that incompatibilities and breakups are normal. So much so that for the first few breakups, Theo bought a cake for the team that had just broken up to lessen the sting. Amidst the whispers, bold introductions, and awkward no's, one of the participants had gone as far as to rank all the candidates from most desirable to least desirable. An impressive feat, if not for his realization, after a conversation with Theo, that this did not in any way influence others' perception of him. Theo turned to me afterwards and said, I told him, you may have this person as your number one, but who's to say they even want to be with you? I watched as people began coupling or grouping up. At times, it was difficult to distinguish between budding friendships and ideal business partners. And here, Julian Obadiah's writing on proximity comes into play, given the close quarters that these participants are thrown into, and what that closeness and shared experience means for the intimacies and relations they are expected to build for the sake of good business partnership. Additionally, they are given tactics and tools for understanding themselves and one another through their profiles, which leads to a process of attunement, the process of reconciling who they are and who they are said to be, whereby they make sense of what these documents say about themselves and what they should present to others in pursuit of partnership. These terms are meant to help the reader understand how participants navigated the program and what kind of expectations are built from this experience, and how this later becomes relevant for a chapter in my thesis that looks at founders' agreement contracts. Eventually, I came to understand that this style of incubation centered more than an individual's capacity to think up a business idea. It mobilized their emotional capacities to build partnerships with their co-founders that could withstand the trials of entrepreneurship. Partnerships are a valued entity and a symbol of cooperation and peace and productivity. And in as much as partnerships dispel notions of self-interest and competition, they're also touted as moving along the cogs of capital when involving organizations with shared objectives and agendas. In scholarship on incubators and entrepreneurialism, the feelings generated by these spaces and tendencies are bound to the idea of making a difference or doing something good with a large scalable reach. These expectations are not entirely new to these participants. Each of them would have had to position themselves as capable of taking on the task when applying and when being recruited. Sarah Ahmed says, a social experience might be how we are thrown by contingency. The experience of willing together might depend upon a pre-existing openness to others, a capacity to be affected and directed by an encounter. And this social experience of living closely, learning not only what was being taught in the sessions, but also about the respective countries represented. One person recounted, no, Rwandans I know, they're like our brothers, but Ethiopians, they were a mystery to me, so I learned a lot about them. One of the former cohort members shared after we had met at one of the demo days. And he was not the only one with this reflection. One morning, as we were standing in line to put away our dishes, I asked one of the women who I spoke to infrequently how things were going. She responded with a general sense of contentment before thinking back to a conversation she had had with one of the participants from Ethiopia. She said to me, did you know that Ethiopia was never colonized? That's kind of cool, but that means their economy is quite disconnected from the global economy. So cool, but bad for capitalism. And she was not exactly wrong. She was not the first person I met throughout my fieldwork to connect colonialism and capitalism, yet to come to this conclusion after having conversed with someone from Ethiopia in the context of willing to now participate in capitalism to counter the challenges that arise from the post-colonial positioning of their respective nations is somewhat indicative of where all formerly colonized nations and their entrepreneurial citizens find themselves in the pursuit of business-driven solutions. Essentially, liberation through capitalist means, which some may say are opposing elements. We might be able to use Theodore Adorno's negative dialectics to work through these tensions as we move forward in understanding scalable and transferable solutions. The participants were given a set of concepts and tools to work through their business ideas. Among these concepts was non-consumption. The concept of non-consumption is significant here because it refers to a lack of service or product that essentially prevents society or consumers from fulfilling a greater contribution or completing an essential task, sometimes called jobs to be done. And this can be anything from getting their kids to school, participating in the economy through farming or small-scale business, or saving money through the banking system. The term comes out of the same institution that published the pivotal text, The Prosperity Paradox. And the official mantra in general startup spaces being that a problem is also a business opportunity. And over the weeks, expert facilitators joined the participants to workshop their business idea in the lead up to the final demo day. The idea was that the participants would come up with a business that could work in either Rwanda, Kenya, or Ethiopia, or ideally in at least 2 of the 3 countries possible. This was as much a chance to learn about each other's countries as it was to learn about one another as individuals and potential co-founders. Further in the program, the participants were taken to relevant institutions in the tech ecosystem, as well as the headquarters of one of the success stories for a high-impact business, Zipline. Now, Zipline is a drone delivery company that first tested its concept in 2016 in Rwanda, developing medical supplies in hard-to-reach rural areas in the country with the help of the government of Rwanda. A red and white plane, the machine is essentially meant to look like an ambulance in the sky. Today, they operate in a number of countries, albeit not exclusively for medical supplies. It is often touted as one of the best examples of the proof of concept approach in Rwanda. In its 30-year National Development Agenda Vision 2050, the government of Rwanda lists one of its objectives as being a proof of concept destination country. A proof of concept here refers to the pilot or testing of a business idea or technology to see the uptake and feasibility for it to succeed and eventually scale beyond a place like Rwanda. And this is what makes the Rwandan case so enticing from the outside, for Africans and non-Africans alike. For whatever story of poor governance was recounted by the participants from Kenya or Ethiopia in the presence of a Rwandan, there was an assurance that the state in Rwanda would not have let that happen. Referring to the high level of government accountability, this was also the appeal of starting or expanding a business into Rwanda. Following their return from the visit, one of the Ethiopian women, who was quick to greet me whenever she saw me, made a beeline in my direction. I asked her, how was the visit to Zipline? And she replied, it was good. Have you been? I mean, it's crazy how they thought of it. Like, is that what we're meant to come up with a mix of awe and intimidation? Once Boaz, the person I mentioned earlier, was in a team, they began working on an idea together. They would leverage the experiences they had between the two of them, landing on a venture focused on learning poverty. Now, learning poverty, according to the World Bank, refers to the inability of a 10-year-old child to read and understand a short age-appropriate text. It's a joint concept produced by the World Bank and UNESCO. And I listened to him explain this to one of the facilitators, Kwesi, a Ghanaian sociologist working with systems thinking alongside his co-facilitator. Kwesi interrogated this idea, asking, what is this learning poverty? These literacy metrics tend to prioritize literacy in English, but what about literacy in Kinyarwanda? And anyway, is this not the role of the government? He asked. There is a fine line between a capitalizable problem and a structural one. And this is also a process of attunement and from finding the middle ground through interacting with one another. The final step in this residential part of the program was a demo day, where the teams presented their business ventures. If they passed this round, they would go on to the venture creation stage. And this meant that they would be supported by the foundation for a year while they found their footing as an official company. I sat down with one of the more consistently stable teams, Lactono, whose members I had grown close to. They decided to launch their business in Ethiopia, given that 2 out of the 3 members were Ethiopian. And their primary target market was those who are lactose intolerant, but also Orthodox fasters in Ethiopia. They were already in conversation with an institute in Addis Ababa for an MOU to develop a patented product, reminding me that they have to be careful about calling their product milk. I had heard from someone at the residence that they had broken up. And I asked them about this. Jason, the Kenyan in the group, laughed and they confirmed. He began to tell me what happened. In the weeks leading up to the demo day presentation were emotionally heavy and mentally taxing. The fine-tuning of the pitch and the broader business concept, all while navigating their somewhat newly formed team in the confines of their shared living space. At some point, Bilan, one of the women, fell ill. Jason said, nothing too serious, but I guess she was feeling quite terrible. However, with the deadline fast approaching, Jason and Amara felt it necessary to prioritize the preparation. He continued, perhaps it didn't help that with the pressure accumulating, we didn't really have the proper channels to air it out. Everything was working fine before demo day. Maybe she felt like we could have been more caring. I don't know. After their successful presentation, Beelan decided to break away from the group, becoming a solo founder. There was another problem. Beelan wanted to work on the same idea as the original group, the plant-based milk alternative. She would have to find another teammate in time for the final demo day to pitch a competing version with this level of stress. Teams were not seeking any further destabilization. When they brought the issue to Theo, he was frank with them. They needed to get back together. He said, at this point, it wasn't only about our team or their team. It was about the community. Theo told us that our team was a kind of like hallmark for the others. Even with our internal issues, we were still doing the work. And people saw how well we worked together and that our breakup was starting to demoralize people. Here we can see how Theo's capacity to identify what their breakup meant to the broader dynamic of the program participants in turn helps to motivate the group to reconcile along with the tools that they were given. They went on to tell me that they found themselves reverting back to the conflict management lessons learned during the difficult conversation session they had earlier in the program. They shared that it helped steer the conversation to reflect on things they might have been doing wrong along the way in terms of how they were addressing or avoiding certain tensions or perceptions of situations. Jason said, we had just been assuming positive intent. And in the end, they reasoned that even though it seemed like an issue that Beelan was working on the same project, it was actually a strength. It meant that their business was bigger than them, that they were all still committed to the idea. They eventually reconciled, but I would argue it does bring up questions around the bounds of these relationships. If friendship isn't conducive to a good business partnership and too much of a business partnership leaves little room to expect care, but can still motivate others in the same pursuit, what can we learn from anthropology and other social scientific scholars who look at partnering in other contexts to think the place of emotion and relationships to make sense of these emotional worlds? So across Africa as a whole, the number of incubators and hubs has climbed to several hundred in recent years, with philanthropies, venture capital investments, development agencies, and governments pouring millions into these programs. And these spaces essentially bring together highly talented and motivated individuals. But that is not to say that they are immune to the pressures and emotional processes that characterize their endeavors. Psychometric tests have their merit, but in its gaps, participants learn and rely on their capacities to relate and build relationships with the input of facilitators and program managers that leverage their emotional labor. The key point I hope to make is that as incubator participants negotiate skills, traits, and expertise or experience when choosing one's co-founder, that there are other processes of relating to one another and where they come from that go into the task of building business solutions together. Thank you.
Thank you, Zarreen. It's a lot to both process and reflect, so I'm going to open up. So questions, comments? Amina. Okay, Amina Gucci. Yes, please. We're going to take sets of 3.
Thank you so much. I think hearing you talk about it, I just looked at me and laughed because we went to undergrad university model, which we visited in Rwanda, that really like focused on kind of building the ideal entrepreneur. But then as you were describing, I've never watched that Japanese TV series, but it's one where people have to like run around and like kill each other. It's very morbid.
Oh.
Squid Games.
Yeah.
And then now I'm just imagining you in this incubator, in this Squid Game kind of imagery. How how did you end up there? And if you could also tell us how did they perceive you, and like, yeah, I just would love to know more about your mobility within that space, and the kinds of relationships that you had with. Thank you.
Uchi?
Since I'm trying to get a grasp of what you're doing as a factor. Do you think, looking at the emotional aspect of it, should full temperament be looked at before you bring them together? And, different temperament, not only looking at their skill or what they want to achieve. So if you look at their temperament, different temperament, when you bring them together, they will surely succeed at the end of the day, more than the issues. Because your humans, they will surely be issues. But how we handle it is what one. If you have looked at that,
Okay. All right. Okay. Good. Let me start with yes, let me start with Sako. Yes. Kwasi, and then okay.
Very interesting because start out as a very important element for growth, especially in a continent where we so lag behind in terms of business innovations and other things. I'd like to find out, thinking about the anxieties and other things within this, is it that there was a pitch where these participants were competing with each other or something like that?
Okay. Maybe you should answer this 4 for now.
3.
And then there's another 4 waiting.
3.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I can. So I think I can go back to
Because this,
question.
Amina, Ugochi, and Kwasi.
Yes, exactly. So thanks for all of your questions. I mean, I can definitely recognize that maybe this would have been a familiar setting in some way. And it's interesting that you use Squid Game as the comparison, because people often use Love Island as the like TV example. But in terms of like my positioning and such, and how I ended up there. So I started here at this law and tech center, and I'm like pseudonymizing the name by throwing some words around. And they essentially provide support, legal compliance support to this incubator. And I had also been sitting at this Swedish co-working and entrepreneurship hub, and that's where they are, that's where their offices are. So I was kind of floating around in this space, initially only sort of working between the Law and Tech Center and the co-working and entrepreneurship hub. But I kept hearing this incubator coming up, and I also sat in on a few meetings where they've gone through this whole process already, and then they're drafting these like founders agreement contracts. And my fieldwork was kind of a bit flipped in a way, because I saw all this like legal processing of like becoming a startup, deciding who does what, shares, and all these other things. And then I ended up there. I went like, ooh, so this is all the emotional work that goes into this process that ends up being like a contracted entity thing. As for my positioning, I think they were a bit confused, understandably so. They were like, oh, who's this extra person? Is she like a participant who was late? It came up that I was South African, so then they thought I was sometimes from the like place, which makes sense, I guess. Or sometimes they thought I would be able to give insight in some way. And I think as an ethnographer or as an anthropologist, there's a lot of emphasis on not really intervening as much. So it was a bit of a balancing act of not wanting to lose relevance because you still want people to talk to you, but not wanting to present myself as anyone other than someone who was there to just learn from them. And actually, with whether should people be looked at before, I think there was a lot of that in a way. It's quite an extensive recruitment process, and I think this is kind of what the psychometric profiles are meant to pull out. I don't think I managed to go deeply into it, but these are the categories that they have. They're like 4 categories: task-oriented, thinking, people, and results, which are a little bit vague, admittedly, but when you read these reports that they write about them, it gives the impression of like being known very well. And so there's quite a lot of emphasis on the participants themselves managing themselves in a way, so that no one can know you better than you, kind of thing. Yeah. So I think really the only way they get tested is in this bubble, and it is a bit of a bubble. It's about an hour away from Kigali. It's like a kind of like a camp setup, like a summer camp. And so it's very odd conditions, I think, to put people in, but sometimes it works. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Merci.
And the place of competition, I mean, yes and no. I think comparison rather than competition, because at this point they don't really have anything yet. So if there were like, maybe there might have been some feelings of that, but I think comparison more so than anything. Yeah.
Great. Starting with Haley.
Clarity, in order to understand the things you're working. I was wondering, what will inform your encounters with the people in the startups? And what was the aim of those interviews, quasi-interviews? I ask because I'm interested in understanding how people make sense of the interpersonal dynamic of the nature of the interview. Given the context in which it's happening, and I imagine that it was quite the business settings can be competitive, especially if there's something at stake. And there's your presence then. How do they understand your presence in the context of all of that?
Do you mean for the incubator or for the whole project?
Your presence where you were engaging with them. I think you were engaging with them primarily as incubators.
The incubator was maybe about 1/3 of my field work.
Okay.
Yeah. But I can tell you.
I'm interested in the pressure cooker way that you explained.
Sure.
Okay, great. Fanit.
Conclusions of what's going on subjectivity, and in terms of the relationship between, or like the kind of confusion, or like the, I don't know, the interaction between a friendship and then partnership, and what that kind of says about how people are in this kind of context, and maybe like the, yeah, just that.
Okay, we are going to Abuna.
Because you did mention that the participants were age 19, that was the 21 and above. So 21 and above, I'm wondering, putting like a 21-year-old together with say 45-year-old person, a young 21-year-old woman, 45-year-old man together, sharing ideas. Do you think that psychometry is enough? or were there other such critical factors that arose?
Okay. Tina?
But they both are you. I'm curious to know what your personal interest is in the study, like is it the startups and why? I mean, it's not something I'm interested in, so it's hard for me to imagine what motivates someone to be interested in this. And then you said in response to, at the end of your response to Gucci, that that it sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So what do you think? Has it worked in this instance?
Okay. Last. Okay. Allah walai. Okay, I have to keep that group because otherwise it's going to add up to it. So yes, if you can get to these ones and as succinct as you can,
Okay,
then you will
sure.
give a space for these others to join.
Yes. Okay, so the form of my encounters, I would say, Haley, thanks for your question, that, let's see, there were interviews in this particular instance. Because it was also very time sensitive, I was also careful not to sort of take more time than I needed to. If anything, if they had like a task to do, they would go off somewhere and I would just ask them, can I sit here and listen in and things like that. I would tell people, look, I'm not necessarily interested in the idea itself, because I think my interest was not necessarily on like the actual business concept itself, whether or not it was a good concept or not. And I wasn't going to go around and say, well, this team does this and maybe you should also this kind of thing. So interviews took place, or like informal, semi-structured interviews took place after the demo day, like when I could see that the biggest task had been completed. But no, otherwise it really was just a matter of being there. And I think what ended up happening was that because it's so cut off from like even the city itself, Kigali, it's them and it's the other participants and then it's the facilitators and the staff there. And so the only other person that you can vent to would be me, because I'm this random person that somehow isn't sharing business secrets or trying to find out like anything that is deemed super important for what they're there to do. Yeah, that helps. And Fanid, so maybe I think this can also come into Abena's question of like whether this psychometric tests are enough. Because most of the participants that I spoke to gave the impression that they were not necessarily like, they had a very, what I would consider to be like a neoliberal line of reasoning, which is like, yes, colonialism did a lot of damage. It sort of set us back and but the time is now. And so we will move forward and through our grit and our ingenuity and our willpower, we will persevere. And I think it was only in these like small sort of conversations of like, say, Ethiopia was not colonized, and so in one way that's good, in another way that's bad, and the bad is actually the fact that, yeah, anyway. So in terms of like its effect, its influence on friendship and partnership and such, it was difficult to say because I don't necessarily think those were the basis of the friendship and the partnering, but it was almost more like you come from a shared standpoint. There's no need to really explain that much because there are some similarities. If I have to continue this couple metaphor, it's almost like if you're like not in an interracial, intercultural relationship, and then there's just an ease, as opposed to if you're constantly translating and trying to explain things, maybe in that regard. because that was another thing in my broader fieldwork that helped. Sometimes people were not immediately, they didn't immediately read me as African. And if I said I was South African, then their tone changed. Then they would tell me other things. It was a very devastating realization that people were thinking that I was Swedish and I was not broken. Anyway. But yes, as to whether I think psychometric tests are enough, I think it's quite limiting in the sense that this is still a very quantitative space. It wants to produce metrics and to say, because of course, like funding and financing is on the line, right? And so numbers are important and things like that. If anything, though, I think it does matter that you have capable facilitators and staff in these programs to be attuned to this emotional process and not just say like, you're being too emotional, like stop it now, like put it to the side, because in some ways emotions can be very productive. Like emotions are not just hysteria and anger and stuff, they're all these other things. Yes, and then Tina, with my personal interest in this and in startups, I think at the beginning of the presentation, I said that I wanted this project to look at investment and philanthropy as a deviation away from development aid. Because when I started this PhD program, I was living in Sweden, and the Swedish government had made a shift in its development policy away from research and capacity building towards innovation and entrepreneurship. And then at the same time, this Swedish co-working entrepreneurship hub popped in. And I come at it from the angle of Sweden because now that's where I live. But Sweden had never had like much of a presence outside of its development corporations in Rwanda. And then it had an embassy sometime later, like 10 years after. And now they've got this ideal private sector presence there. And so I'm curious about like this shift of putting the responsibility of like progress and growth and development on individuals when the structure remains a little bit untouched or uninterrogated. Yeah.
Okay. I saw 3 hands. Okay. Your hand is not up. Okay, let's start with 1 hand. One. Susan, did I see your hand? Oh, okay. That's last. We end with Susan. Okay.
Thank you very much for there's a lot to think about, particularly in the way we understand how capitalism becomes encroached in our everyday decision making. Even in our imagination of what constitutes man, the position of the material in such programs still becomes that which determines social relation. So there's that. But I think my question, I have 2 questions. And the first question revolves around emotion. How do you define emotion? And also, how do you situate senses as if they are formed? You mentioned that how do you situate emotion? How do you situate senses as if they are formed? Then how do you think about how you situate? So how do you make sense of your own situatedness of emotion? That's the first question. The second question is around positionality and the body. And in field science, you don't mention the body. Yet again, you work around emotions. You then situate emotions, but you cannot exempt the body as a study. So how and where do you situate and position your own body in the project?
Okay. Thank you. Did I see your hand up? Okay. Okay. Sir.
Thank you again for the presentation. I would like to hear more about the anthropology of the culture.
Okay.
but I think somehow we'll ask that. So I have like kind of similar question
About emotions.
about emotions, yeah.
Mm.
But also in the sense of your own situation, what kind of emotions,
Mm.
you know, that you also kind of engage in what the field is, because I mean, like, the whole idea of startups and looking at startups as the future of work, probably in Africa and in the future. I mean, I don't know exactly what startups that we look at. I don't, sorry, maybe I'll just, my mind blacked out. But like in my case, when I look at startups, and like technology startups and the future of work, you know, and the future of labor, and when people are directed to, you know, evolve, bring solutions, and yeah, so we find ourselves, I mean, we understand technology, we find ourselves driven for places where the technology is available. And that would be the startup of our work, but then it's interesting for me to see your lingering in that space, like that space, as Tina said, it's not, it's a bit, you know, like, because it's not her interest, so she can't imagine why someone would be interested and be excited about the space where there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of love and hate, and you know, so this is where your emotions also come in.
Okay, great. Susan? Oh, okay. Susan.
Initially, I think my mind was wandering around the sample size. So I think you mentioned 50 participants, the sample size. So my mind was wandering along the line of qualitative, but I think as we are answering one of the questions you mentioned, that this is more of a quantitative scale. So I was wondering, is that one project or 50 for analysis?
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. The record. This closest.
I was curious about the emotions. Like the Ahmed, and I think she talks about emotion. Emotion. So I was interested in how you conceptualize, and not so much, yes, you as a researcher, but just in terms of like how you're reading.
Okay. You should take the ones you can answer, and some you can say, I'm here until December. So you have the freedom to decide. You have 3 minutes. So use them as best as possible.
Sure. I can just quickly like clarify with Susan. It's I mean, this is I'm an anthropologist, so I don't touch quantitative methodology. I more meant like the rhetoric is quantitative, like they prioritize quantitative outputs to determine their success. But no, like I think of the 50, I did not speak to all of the 50 even, because this wasn't my main field site. So I was floating around a bit, like a bit here, a bit here, a bit here. And then also, then to clarify, because this wasn't my main field site, I kind of actually stumbled into this space. This project has sort of always been conceived of as like an economic anthropology project, and even then, I cannot come and tell you that I have like the best expertise when it comes to, say, finance and economics and such. And I wasn't actually even looking for this kind of angle to the research. It's a bit of an outlier in my thesis. It's my juiciest chapter, like it's the most exciting and the most fun to write and such. But it's a little bit of an outlier, and I think it's because I'm looking at in response to the space that prioritizes quantitative metrics to determine success. And I'm looking at like a process of legibility and making things standard and making things complete and legible, readable. This chapter in this presentation is a little bit, it's not as fully fledged out as I would like it to be. So I actually don't have an answer to your question. I would be so like happy to engage in that conversation, because it's not an area that I've read very deeply in, because I've been reading so much like anthropology of finance, anthropology of capitalism stuff. So if anything, I would like be interested to try and marry the two to get a deeper understanding of where emotion sits, because we already know there is like a literature of emotion in anthropology of capitalism. Like that's how we get emotional labor and affective labor and emotional capitalism and stuff. But yeah, I can't say that I have a set and ready definition of emotion, because it's admittedly not something that I intended to write about. Is it? Anything else? Oh yes, anthropology of becoming. Actually, same answer. This chapter has been great to work on because it is such a deviation from what I expected and predominantly read. So yeah, hopefully we can continue having that conversation until December.
Great. Yeah.
Yep.
You done?
I think, yeah, I'm done.
So thank you, Zarreen. And Zarreen is here, so please engage further. Next week we are going to be listening to Ugochi Okengu, who will be talking to us something. It's about agriculture and AI. And we're looking forward